One Casey, man, what's up? Good to meet you. First off, how you doing? How's your day going?
It's been a bit of a crazy day. I was on vacation last week. This is my first day back in the office after vacation. So, you know how that goes. It's like, oh my gosh, it takes a lot of work to go on vacation, and that's the vacations are great, but you pay for it on either end. So I'm paying for it right now.
That's so true. Did I don't know where you went on vacation, but is it one of those vacations where you just overeat and kind of overindulge the whole time?
Um, Hardly actually. I was visiting family down in Southern California, but my cousin and I and his son went camping on Catalina Island, and it was pretty primitive. We actually had no water, no bathrooms, no electricity, and also no shade for about 3 days. It was super fun. But definitely we were not eating gourmet. I had like, cans of chili and packets of rice. We had a great time, did a lot of fishing, snorkeling and kayaking, just had an epic time. It was really cool. Yeah. So I'm
Very, very cool. That's yeah, a little different. I just went on family vacation. Of course, all we did was eat. So I was like trying to figure out my eating habits when I get back in Greenville. I
I've done those too. I've done those too.
Yeah, right. Sometimes you get the best of both worlds. I'm excited to have you on. I was telling you before we press record that recently this has been a big topic in my mind, in my brain. I've been trying to figure out what intelligent design is and the evidence behind it, and just like, you know, once you dive into it, you realize there's this huge community out there for both kind of sides of, is it human evolution, is it intelligent design, where do they collide? And doing research, I found you at Discover Institute, and I got linked up with you, and I'm very excited to have you on. Can you tell people more of your background, and then we'll kind of get into what intelligent design is?
Sure. So I work at Discovery Institute, which is we call ourselves the leading institutional home or a think tank for the theory of intelligent design. And we can get into what the theory of intelligent design is, but we are a think tank. We're nonpartisan, nonprofit, public policy think tank. We deal with many issues from transportation to communication to foreign affairs, economics, urban planning, education, bioethics, leadership. But I think we're most well known for our work in the area of origins and how did life begin? What is the origin of the universe? Are we the result of strictly unguided material evolutionary processes, or is there some design behind life and the universe? So my academic background is I got my undergraduate and master's degree in earth sciences from the University of California, San Diego. And while I was there, I actually took a lot of courses in evolution at the undergraduate and graduate levels. So I sort of have a pretty solid background in evolutionary biology. And then I went to law school. Actually, I decided to get a job. I should maybe go to law school. So I went to law school and I became a California licensed attorney. I've been a California licensed attorney since 2005. And then at the very end of 2015, early 2016, I went back to school. I thought I was done with school. I'd sworn off school, but somehow it got me. And I went back and got a PhD in geology at the University of Johannesburg. So my wife and I moved to Johannesburg in South Africa for about a little under 4.5 years, and had an amazing experience doing that. I got a PhD in geology there. And again, had many opportunities also while I was there to learn about the topic of human evolution. My research was on Archean geology. So my PhD topic was not on human evolution, but I was able to visit many of the famous hominid fossil sites and hominid fossil museums, interact with some leading paleoanthropologists, people at some of the top, human origins research institutes in the world. Had a lot of great opportunities to learn about the topic of human origins while I was there. And it really increased sort of my skepticism of the standard evolutionary story of human origins. So my role at Discovery Institute is I'm associate director of our Center for Science and Culture. Our Center for Science and Culture is essentially our intelligent design or ID program, as we call it. And one of my major roles there, or here I should say, as I help to manage our what we call our ID 3.0 research program, where basically we're funding research of scientists both around the United States and also internationally. And we're funding research into intelligent design. I manage a lot of these research projects. I also do a lot of legal work still, helping basically to defend and advise teachers, faculty members, students, parents, educators of different backgrounds to be able to talk about this debate openly in schools or in universities without having to fear for their jobs or getting fired or, getting kicked out of the graduate program or whatever. So I do a lot of the sort of the academic freedom side of things as well. Although my main focus is the science, and that's certainly what I prefer to do is on the science side of things. So yeah, that's a little bit about me and sort of a little bit about Discovery Institute.
When you were growing up, and I guess maybe till 2015 or 2017, 2018, where did you stand on human evolution, and how did that, change or evolve to intelligent design?
Sure. So, well, I mean, I think to talk about my journey with intelligent design, we have to go back to my college days, because I worked at Discovery Institute from 2005 onwards. So I've been a proponent of intelligent design for a long time. And it started off for me when I was, as an undergraduate at UC San Diego, I was taking all these courses in evolution, and I wanted to understand evolution. I wanted to learn about it. UC San Diego, I don't know if it still is. I think it probably is. But at the time I was there, it was the #1 public university for biology research in the entire United States. So they have a very, very strong scientific biological focus at UC San Diego. And, I wanted to learn about this topic. And so I was taking courses in evolution. I remember the very first course I took, my first semester of my freshman year, was called History of the Earth and Evolution. And I would get up at this, when you're an undergraduate freshman, like, you can't get up before like 10 a.m. because you're up hanging out, talking to friends every night in the dorms. But somehow I had this 8 a.m. class that I'd get up for, run across, just literally running across the quad, almost half in my pajamas still, and get there right as it would start. But in this class, we were learning about how natural selection works and all the complex organisms that have appeared over the history of life. And in that and other courses I was thinking, okay, can you evolve these complex features we see in living organisms in the little step-by-step manner, one little mutation at a time, a manner that is required by Darwin's theory? And I thought, it seems like there's a lot of features that are highly complex, where lots of parts, lots of complexity needs to be present before that part is going to work to give you some advantage to help you to survive and reproduce. And so in my very sort of, no offense to college freshman, I was still, working things out. And in my sort of rudimentary freshman way of thinking, I was thinking, there seems to be a problem here that the evolutionary mechanism faces, that it can't build things in this step-by-step mechanism that's required by neo-Darwinian evolution, the modern theory of evolution, in order to build these complex features. It's not going to get you there. You have to have all this complexity there all at once, or it's not going to work at all. And so at the end of my freshman year, a buddy of mine, who was also a science major, suggested I read this book called Darwin's Black Box. And I don't know if you've heard of that, Sam, but Darwin's Black Box is a very foundational book in the intelligent design world. It's by a biochemist at Lehigh University named Michael Behe. And in that book, he basically coins this concept of irreducible complexity. And really what he did was he put into words what my rudimentary freshman brain had been thinking that whole year, that he came up with this idea where basically there are many features in biology that are irreducibly complex. If you reduce their complexity at all, then they stop working. And they basically require a core number of parts in order for them to function. These parts, by definition, cannot be built in the gradual, stepwise manner required by the theory, the mechanism of natural selection and random mutation that the modern theory of evolution requires. And so they're a major challenge to Darwin's theory. And in that book, Michael Behe doesn't just talk about, larger organisms. He talks about irreducible complexity at the biochemical level, where we've discovered, and this is, for me, was really an amazing, eye-opening book to read. I learned a lot about how the cell works reading this book, that the cell is full of what we call micromolecular machines, that there are all these miniature protein robots that are running around our cells, performing all kinds of important functions. And many of these machines contain lots of different protein parts, protein components that are all interface compatibility, where they can work together to form some function, much like a machine with multiple parts. I'm not saying that the cell is a machine, but I'm saying it contains many smaller structures that are what we would call molecular machines. And this term is used not just by the intelligent design community. You can find many mainstream researchers have compared, these functional components in cells to molecular machines. In fact, Bruce Alberts, who's a former member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, he says the entire cell can be viewed as a factory that contains an elaborate network of interlocking assembly lines, each of which is composed of a large set of protein machines. Why do we call the large protein assemblies that underlie cell function protein machines? Precisely because, like machines invented by humans to deal efficiently with the macroscopic world, these protein assemblies contain highly coordinated moving parts. That's a quote from a former president of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. No friend of intelligent design, but certainly an expert in biochemistry and cell biology and molecular biology. So in this book I read by Michael Behe, he described many of these molecular machines, things like the bacterial flagellum, which is like an outboard motor that allows bacteria to swim around to find food, or other molecular machines like the cilium, which are used in higher organisms, kind of like a whip-like structure. We have cilia all over our bodies to move fluid around, move mucus, to move all kinds of parts within our bodies. And these molecular machines, he argues that they are irreducibly complex, and they pose sort of a fundamental challenge to the Darwinian explanation that we always hear about in our classrooms and in PBS Nova documentaries and all that. So for me, that was my first introduction to intelligent design, and it just all went downhill from there. I started reading other books by ID proponents, started taking more classes, and started just learning about this debate, and just really dove deep into it and got really interested in it.
So for me to understand that, that's me thinking, if you look at humans, our DNA, our molecules, the way we are designed is almost more complex than what natural selection could have provided.
I certainly agree with that. I think that natural selection requires that every little mutation gives you some advantage in survival and reproduction. You can also have mutations that don't hurt you, okay? I mean, we often have mutations that are called neutral mutations, that don't really do anything. But when you're going to build some feature up, you're going to build some complex feature that helps us to survive and reproduce, whether it's we're talking about, molecular machines in our cells, or the eye, or, hearing. Every mutation that is making some, change needs to give you some advantage to help you better survive and reproduce, or it's not going to be passed on to the next generation, or at least there's no reason why it should be passed on to the next generation. If it does get passed on, maybe just by chance. But the way Darwin's theory is supposed to work is it wants to say, we can give you a rationale for why these mutations are going to, accumulate to build these complex features, because each successive mutation helps you get better and better at doing something. Okay. And so you build things up one little step at a time. What we see with these irreducibly complex structures is that you have to have all of this complexity present all at once, or the system doesn't work to give you some advantage, some benefit in surviving and reproducing. So you can't build them up one little mutation at a time. So what kind of a cause can basically put together all of these complex components all at once to give you some new feature to help you survive and reproduce? Well, we would argue that the best explanation for the origin of these irreducibly complex structures is a mind, is an intelligent agent, because an intelligent mind can think with forethought and will and intentionality to come up with some complex blueprint that will bring together a bunch of very precise parts to give you some function ready to go all at once as soon as you need it. And that's exactly what we see in biology, these complex features that require many parts to be there all at once, or they don't work. So it's it looks like it requires the kind of forethought and planning that would require a mind to be the cause of its origin.
Gotcha. To certainly understand what you're saying, with the history of intelligent design, where would y'all say it started, or where are some of the first examples you could say?
Well, the debate over our origins goes back thousands of years. It goes back to the ancient Greeks, where you had people like Plato and Aristotle who actually believed that there was a mind that was behind the universe. And then you had other, ancient philosophers. Democritus is one who was more like an atheist, who believed that, nature could essentially create itself. And so this is not a new debate. It's been carried out throughout, both Western civilization and probably all civilizations in the world. Certainly in the great Islamic civilizations, they developed some of these arguments. One of the strongest arguments, I think, that comes out of modern cosmology is looking at the Big Bang. And the Big Bang points to an origin, an abrupt origin to our universe, which points to sort of almost like a creation event. And it was Muslim scholars, also some Christian scholars were involved with this, who developed something called the Kalam cosmological argument, which is an argument that says that anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a first cause. And modern cosmology has shown that the universe did begin to exist. It's finite in its age and it's finite in its size. You can retrace it back to an infinitely dense and small point where it was created from. So the universe began to exist. That suggests there's a first cause outside the universe that brought it into existence. Very compatible with this idea of intelligent design, or if you want to believe in a sort of an external creator to the universe. So this debate, this issue has been going on for centuries, millennia. Most recently, though, in the last couple hundred years, so Western civilization, when this modern science, this thing that we currently have science, when it got going, the early scientists, people like Isaac Newton or Boyle or Kepler, they all started doing scientific pursuits because they believed in God. They believed in a law-like creator. And they believed that this law-like creator, this lawgiver, would not just create moral laws for us to live our lives by, but would also create natural laws that would govern the universe. And they believed that by studying nature, they could go out and discover the laws that God used when he made the universe. So they were inspired by their belief in a rational, orderly creator and a lawgiver to go out and study nature and seek to find this, the orderly nature of our universe and the laws that govern it. And because of this, they were spectacularly successful in basically inventing the modern methods of science that scientists even use today. And it was all started because people believed that there was a creator, a rational, orderly creator behind the universe. And that bore very good fruit. They were able to make all kinds of discoveries under their sort of Judeo-Christian theological, inspiration for going out and doing science. It turned out that it worked. So science was very friendly to belief in a creator, belief in an intelligent mind being behind the universe, until really the 1800s, where there was a shift. And that shift, to be quite frank with you, it was a long process, but it did largely center around Darwin's theory of evolution. So prior to Darwin, most people looked at biology and thought that, again, the complexity of life requires a mind. We see, in living organisms, we see even before, we were able to study the cell under the microscope. People knew that living organisms were highly complex. They could look at the heart that pumps blood through the circulatory system. They could look at the eye and see how it reflects light in order for us to be able to have vision. All kinds of these complex features, people thought, okay, this requires, a mind, an intelligent cause. And so even prior to Darwin, we can see the term intelligent design being used in the scientific literature, okay? But when Darwin comes along, he says, you know what? I've got a different explanation for how the complexity of life diversified and arose. It's called natural selection. And I can explain this without any recourse to a mind or a God or, an intelligent agent. And so when Darwin came up with that idea, it did sort of initiate, it was a major domino that fell in a shift that was going on to change the way science operated and really move science away from seeing, the evidence as pointing to a mind or a creator behind the universe and life. And really that we sort of live in this purposeless, meaningless universe that is strictly material. There's nothing more than matter and energy, and that can explain everything, just basically matter in motion, and essentially matter comes before mind rather than mind coming before matter. And so Darwin's theory had a major impact, not just on biology, but upon many of the sciences, just that way of thinking, that way of approaching science. And so what we like to say here at Discovery Institute is that, that really was 19th century science, okay? Darwin's theory isn't completely wrong. I mean, natural selection, there's no question, it is a real force that operates in nature. We can see it when we have antibiotic resistance, for example, where, a strain of bacteria doesn't get killed by some antibiotic. Well, it's being selected for, and then it survives and it reproduces, and then, you get an antibiotic resistant strain. Okay, fine. Natural selection is real. But what we would say is that now that we've sort of opened up what we call the black box of the cell and discovered all the complexity of what's really going on under the hood in biology, Michael Behe called his book Darwin's Black Box. We've opened up this black box of the cell. We're now seeing a complex world of miniaturized factories and molecular machines that Darwin could only have dreamed of. And it really outstrips the ability of natural selection to explain. So I would say that, the modern theory of intelligent design got a real boost when we started to understand the complexity of the cell, things like DNA, the information in our DNA, things like the molecular machines that we're finding in the cell. And also for modern cosmology, things like discovering that the universe started off with a bang, billions of years ago, where, that bang points to a first cause. Things like what we call the fine tuning of the universe, where we can see that many of the laws and constants of the laws of physics have to be just right in order to yield a universe where life can exist. All this very, very precise fine tuning of the laws of physics, where they have to be exactly the way they are, or you can't have a universe where life can exist. We're making all these discoveries that are pointing to a designer. We would say that intelligent design got a major boost from many of the recent discoveries of, say, the last 10, 20, 50, 80 years in science. But the idea of intelligent design is really nothing new, and has a tradition within science that goes back not just centuries, but actually, I would argue, millennia.
Does Darwin's theory have an explanation of Big Bang and the creation of the universe?
So no, and I wouldn't criticize Darwin's theory for that. I mean, Darwin's theory is supposed to be an explanation for how new species arise. All right. I mean, it was called the origin of species, right? And he was trying to make a biological explanation for how a new form of life can arise from a pre-existing form of life through natural selection. There's variation within a population. Sure. Some members of that population are better able to survive and reproduce than others. And so they tend to leave more offspring, and the species naturally evolves in their direction. That's natural selection in a nutshell. His theory was never intended to apply to modern cosmology or physics. Now, what we see in modern cosmology and physics is, I would say, similarly materialistic models that are only invoking sort of matter and energy to try to explain away, the evidence for the fine tuning. So we see ideas like the multiverse being brought up in physics and cosmology. I don't know if you're a Marvel fan, but there's been a lot of talk about the multiverse in the last few years. So I mean, Spider-Man, it's a great movie, but it really brought this idea out into the mainstream, right? That there's many different universes. Well, the reason that idea exists is because physicists realized that there is a degree of fine tuning in the laws of nature that's so extraordinary that you would have to envision almost this huge, vast ensemble of universes existing for you to imagine just one single universe getting so lucky, sort of winning that cosmic lottery to get all the parameters just right where life could exist. And we're talking about, numbers like, the precision of some of these fundamental laws and constants that allow for life to exist are, things like 1 in 10 to the 90th power is the degree of precision. That's the precision of the cosmological constant, which controls the expansion of the universe. Or, the value of the gravitational constant. It has to be precise in 1 part in 10 to the 35th power, or you can't get a universe where life can exist. The most impressive one is something called the initial entropy of the early universe. Basically, the distribution of matter and energy and how disordered things were. Cosmologists and physicists have determined that in order to get a universe where you can have matter clumping together to form things like stars and galaxies, which of course would be necessary for life to exist, the fine tuning of the early entropy of the universe would need to be fine tuned within 1 part in 10 raised to the power of 10 to the 123rd power. Okay, so we can't even, you could try to write that number out. Start writing that number out, you're going to die long before you even get close, okay? So the precision of the laws of nature to allow life to exist really is quite extraordinary. And physicists have yet to come up with an explanation for this that invokes sort of materialistic causes. So they like this multiverse idea to try to say, well, if we just sort of imagine that there's this cosmic lottery out there and there's all these other universes with each one has different laws of nature, maybe just by chance, one would get lucky enough to get all these right parameters so life could exist. But there's no evidence for this multiverse, okay? We only have evidence for one universe. And the mechanisms that they invoke, by the way, to try to explain this multiverse, those mechanisms themselves require even more fine-tuning. So you can't really escape the problem of fine-tuning no matter what you do. Even the multiverse does not help you escape the problem of fine-tuning. We can get into that more, but the bottom line is, the evidence for I think the creation of the universe and the design of the universe is really quite extraordinary. Darwin's theory, I'm not going to critique Darwin. It was not intended to explain that, but even from the physicists and cosmologists who are trying to explain that, I don't think they have a good explanation for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do believe, like you said, there's some real world examples of Darwin's theory work that are out there with with life, and not just human life. Is intelligent design also in place for animals and the first, dinosaurs, or the first life we've seen in the universe?
Sure. So in the ID, we call it the ID community. We have this motto that says we're going to follow the evidence where it leads. Okay. So ID does not have a problem that perhaps in some cases natural causes are the best explanation. Okay. We're perfectly happy if the explanation goes, in sort of a natural evolutionary mechanism, but we want to make sure we're testing the evidence in each case to ask what is the best explanation. So for the origin of life, I think that most ID theorists would say that you're not going to be able to produce, say, the first cell or the first self-replicating molecule, which is often what they say. That's the first life form. You're not going to be able to do that through sort of just blind chemical reactions.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the main reasons for that is that life at its fundamental base has information, okay? In our DNA, we have our DNA molecules, basically a long chain of nucleotide bases. There are these base pairs, and they come in 4 different molecules: adenine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine. And these 4 nucleotide bases have to be strung in a very, very specific order to encode all the proteins in your body. Or if you want to talk about, a simple life form like a bacterium, even in a simple bacterium, every single protein in that bacterium is encoded by the order of the nucleotide bases in the DNA. Now, there's no chemical or physical law that says that those bases have to be in any particular order, okay? But yet they are in a very precise order that is just right to allow for these functional proteins to exist. And if you have the wrong ordering of these base pairs, if you get, a mutation, going back to, comic book movies, you get the X-Men or something like that with, in those movies, mutations are always doing something good. But when you look at the literature in the scientific community, usually when we see mutations that are actually doing something, they are invariably damaging to an organism or destroying some function at the biochemical level. So mutations are not very good at building up, getting you the right information you need. Think of writing a computer program, all right? When I did my PhD in geology, I kind of got sucked into the world of Python programming. I ended up writing over 30,000 lines of Python code during my PhD. And what I found is that if you want to put a new function in, you need new lines of code, right? And this was my life for like years. My wife got me a t-shirt that said, "I dream in Python," because it's like all I could think about was Python. It never leaves your head. So in order to generate new lines of code, you don't generate code through randomly typing keys on the keyboard, all right? It just is not going to get you the specificity you need. But yet in our DNA, we see something that is very, very closely analogous, if not almost identical to computer code, where our DNA literally contains commands and codes that are read and interpreted by those machines in your cell to then produce some output. The output would be these protein robots that are going around and performing all the functions in your cells, okay? Mm-hmm. But it starts off with information in the form of computer-like commands and codes in your DNA. Well, random and unguided blind mechanisms don't produce information that is useful, that is going to be, helping to build a functional protein in the same way that you would never use a random number generator to produce computer code. Okay. So we need some cause that can explain how all this information arose in the first forms of life. And we think that, what we're basically seeing in life is a language-based code that is interpreted through computer-like information processing to produce machines. But where in all of our experience do we see language-based codes arising, or computer-like information processing arising, or machine-like structures arising? In all of our experience, those things come only from intelligence. And yet that is what is at the very heart and the very basis of life. And so the origin of life is certainly one key example where we think that an intelligent design would have been necessary to get life going. There's other examples as well. We can get into that. I mean, I think that the origin of animals requires sort of a quantum leap in complexity. We see in the fossil record, you mentioned dinosaurs. When many groups of organisms appear in the fossil record, we see them appearing abruptly. without direct evolutionary precursors. Paleontologists have a word for this. They call it explosions. I took a lot of paleontology in my geology studies. We see explosions throughout the history of life. Okay. In fact, it's the dominant pattern. When new major groups of organisms appear in the fossil record, they appear abruptly without direct evolutionary precursors. It's true for the first major groups of animals. It's true for the first land plants. It's true for the first flowering plants. It's true for the major types of dinosaurs. It's true for major marine animals, major groups of fish. It's true for birds. It's true for mammals. It's true for our own genus Homo sapiens. When our own genus appears in the fossil record, it appears abruptly, very distinct from our supposed ancestors, which are called the Australopithecines. And so we see this pattern throughout the fossil record that does not document slow, gradual evolutionary transitions. And we would argue that the best explanation for this, sort of abrupt appearance is that it's representing a very rapid and massive infusion of large amounts of information into the biosphere. And again, where does information come from? Information comes from intelligence. And so when we see this abrupt appearance of new types of organisms, it's like, when a new kind of technology gets developed, smartphones, and suddenly you get all these new smartphones appearing, okay? Well, the same thing happens in the fossil record. A new kind of organism appears. You see all kinds of new variations of that appearing abruptly without a clear evidence of sort of a gradual evolution from some ancestor. So we think that pattern is also much better explained by intelligent design than the standard evolutionary paradigm that's out there in the scientific community.
Would it, in my thinking, is it something, say, the first intelligent design could have been an animal, could have been a dinosaur, and then there's another explosion of intelligent design where it could have been some sort of species of humans, and then there's another kind of explosion that kind of continues till we get to around where we are?
Well, we try to just take the evidence at face value, and what does it say? And that is what you just said, Sam. Really, very, very good description of kind of what we see in the history of life. We see one type of organism appearing abruptly. Call it we'd say dinosaurs. Okay, and then later on we see another type of organism appear abruptly, birds, and we see diverse groups of birds appearing, again, quite explosively. And then we see the major orders of mammals appearing quite abruptly in a very short period of time, typically without, evidence of some evolutionary, gradual evolutionary pathway being shown from the fossil record. So we do see that pattern throughout the history of life. So, what does this tell you? Well, maybe there were different types of organisms that were progressively designed over the history of life. Maybe Earth was progressively being sort of terraformed and prepared by, an intelligent creator for eventually, the coming of humans, or I don't know. I mean, but it kind of looks like that's kind of what we see going on in the history of life.
Is there, in the intelligent design community, and just communities in general, they could be just people that believe that this is, how human evolution and the origin of humans started. Is there some sense of like what we call the intelligent agent? Is it a god? Is it, where do we, where does that fall in the ID community?
Sure. So before I answer that question, let me just say my own personal view, because I always think it's important just to be very upfront about where you're coming from. I personally am a Christian, and I do believe that the designer is the God of the Bible. So I'm not, I try to be very open and transparent about where I'm coming from. Now I also have a, scientific background, so I hold my views, due to scientific evidence. It's not like my religious beliefs say that intelligent design has to be true. If intelligent design turned out to be false, I would still be a Christian. Okay. But I think it's supported by the evidence. Now, all that being said, within the ID community, we have a diverse group of people of many different backgrounds. We have folks in the ID community who are of a Jewish background or Muslim backgrounds, people of Eastern religious backgrounds, Hindus, Buddhists. We have people who would call themselves agnostics, and certainly we have many Christians as well. What we're all united around is that there is evidence in nature for a designer, being the best explanation for many features of life in the universe. And so you don't have to commit to some particular religious view or whatever view of who the designer is to see that there's evidence for design in nature. It is an idea that stands apart from theology or religion. You don't have to have any religious presuppositions to be able to see that there's evidence for design in nature. A great example of this actually is an atheist named Thomas Nagel, who is a very famous intellectual, and he's written books actually defending intelligent design. I don't know if he fully agrees with it, but he says, look, this is an idea worth taking seriously.
Sure.
On a few years ago, there was an atheist, a philosopher named Bradley Monton, who wrote a book about intelligent design, and the subtitle was "An Atheist Defends Intelligent Design." I think that's what it was. Another interesting example, a philosopher named Anthony Flew. If you and I had been alive in the 1950s and 60s, we definitely would have heard of Anthony Flew, because he was like the guy, he was almost like the Richard Dawkins of that era, who's going out and debating people like C.S. Lewis. Okay, he was a very famous public intellectual atheist who was very critical of religion. Well, in the late 90s, early 2000s, Anthony Flew learned about this new scientific evidence that was coming out supporting intelligent design. And he went through a major intellectual shift where he actually wrote a book that was titled "There Is No God," except on the cover, he crossed out the word "no" and said there is a God. And the book was all about his reasons for this intellectual shift. And the evidence for intelligent design was one of the major reasons he cited, the information in our DNA, and also looking at the evidence from cosmology for a beginning to the universe and the fine tuning of the laws of nature. And so what he said is basically, look, he actually, to my knowledge, never committed to any particular religious belief before he died, but he did convert from atheism to some form of belief in a God, you know, whether it was like a traditional religion. I don't think it was, but he definitely had a major shift. And he came from that strictly from, an atheistic perspective. So you don't have to come at the evidence with religious presuppositions to see that there's evidence for design in nature. And the theory of intelligent design tries to restrict what we can learn from a scientific investigation. So it doesn't try to get into larger, religious questions like, what is the identity of the designer? Although people are very open about what they believe personally, the theory itself doesn't try to specify, who is the designer, et cetera. Those are more, those are important questions. They're very interesting and important questions.
Sure.
But I think that the theory of intelligent design is not going to address that. I think that, you have to address that from other fields like philosophy or theology or history or, those sorts of things. So I would say that intelligent design as a theory does not address the question of who is the designer, but it certainly does point to the fact that there is an intelligent designer behind life in the universe.
Very cool. I think that's a great point of view for it too, because in my own personal experience, I'll go back and forth about, is there a God? Is there multiple gods? But I do believe there is a God, or there's somebody out there. Like, I don't know personally exactly what it is all the time, but I feel like there is something out there that is higher and above us. With the debate of it being taught in schools versus Darwin's evolution in schools, can you talk me through, is it being taught in schools? Why isn't it being taught in schools if it's not? And then the debate why Darwin is being taught in schools.
Sure. So I actually deal with this a lot here at Discovery Institute, helping to advise people on what they should teach in public schools. And at Discovery Institute, we do think that Darwin's theory should be taught in public schools. It's been very influential in modern biology. And there's a lot of interesting and even, in many cases, meritorious aspects to Darwin's theory. And the modern theory of Darwin's theory is what we call neo-Darwinism. It basically incorporates our modern knowledge of genetics and DNA into this idea of natural selection, and explains how natural selection can work within DNA, within the kinds of, discoveries we now understand a little bit more about how life works, obviously. So I do think that the modern theory of evolution should be taught to students in public schools. What we at Discovery Institute say, however, is that when it is taught, you should teach students not just the evidence for that theory. You should learn about the evidence for evolution, but you should also learn about the evidence that challenges evolution. And we've actually have a list of it's now over 1,200 PhD scientists who say that they are skeptical of the ability of random mutation and natural selection to explain the complexity of life. And so, there's many scientists in the scientific community who are very skeptical of the core tenets of the modern theory of Darwin's, the modern version of Darwin's theory. And this is also in the peer-reviewed literature. When you look at the peer-reviewed scientific literature, you can find technical papers that are saying, look, many of these features do not look like they can be built up by this mechanism of natural selection. Or how do we produce new animal forms, what we call new animal body plans?
Mhm.
How do we account for the abrupt appearance of many types of organisms throughout the history of life? These are largely unresolved questions for evolutionary biologists. And you can read that, they recognize these deficiencies in their theories of evolution in the mainstream scientific literature. So we think that if scientists could acknowledge these weaknesses
Mhm.
in the modern theory of evolution, in the technical literature, then students should be able to learn about that, especially if they're already learning about the evidence that supports evolutionary theory. So we think that students should learn about the evidence for and against evolution. So evolution is taught almost universally, ubiquitously around the United States. Almost every single public school district is going to be teaching evolution to its students. There are probably, I would say, somewhere between 8 to 10 states right now that have statewide policies that either require or permit teachers to teach about the scientific problems of evolution alongside the evidence for evolution. So that's good. This is actually allowing students to learn about all the evidence, to sort of have full disclosure of the evidence so they can make up their own minds. It also allows them to engage in critical thinking, to learn
Mhm.
to think like scientists, to weigh the evidence on both sides of a question, and then be able to sort of do critical thinking, critical argumentation, and come up with whatever they think the best answer is. And that's how science is supposed to work. So it's teaching them to actually think like scientists. Now, what about intelligent design? So a lot of folks are actually surprised to hear this, but when it comes to public schools, we actually do not support efforts from public schools to push ID into the curriculum. And the reason for that, Sam, is because we found that when ID gets pushed into public schools, it tends to politicize the debate.
Mhm.
Tends to result in a lot of controversy and lawsuits. And that politicization actually ends up resulting in increased persecution of pro-ID scientists and faculty at the university level. And that persecution ends up actually hindering the ability of those scientists to be able to grow and develop the theory of intelligent design as a science. And that really is our priority with intelligent design. We want to see it grow and develop as a science. That's why we're funding research into it, and not just, saying we want to push this into public schools. We're not trying to do that. We want to see it grow and develop as a science. And so we've tried to, really counsel people when they come to us. We advise them, don't, go and push ID into the public schools, but you should be teaching evolution objectively. It's already in the curriculum.
Mhm.
It's already part of the curriculum. So if you're going to teach it objectively, teach it accurately. Let students use it as an opportunity to gain critical thinking skills
Yep.
and learn how to think like scientists, and give them all the evidence so they can make up their own minds with all the information that's available.
Yeah,
So that's
very
what we
true.
say. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's great. Like point of view of like they're just trying to get all the information so they can use it to think critically to make up their own mind. Is there a way? Is there a reason? Is it because of a religious reason, or why does it get politicized when it does try to get into public schools in a way? Like, what's the pushback? Is there who's pushing back on it?
Well, we have seen this over and over again, Sam, over the last few decades of being involved in this debate. And this is actually something that is really unfortunate. It's a much broader problem now than just intelligent design. But we have seen that by and large, the scientific community is highly intolerant of scientists who are challenging the evolutionary paradigm. Okay. I mean, I've worked on cases where scientists were denied tenure or denied a job, or students were kicked out of graduate programs, or scientists lost their lab space or their funding because of their support for intelligent design. And unfortunately, we want to think that science is totally open-minded and always open to new ideas. And I'm not saying all scientists are like this. I mean, I think a lot of scientists are open to hearing new ideas and are
Mhm.
open-minded. But unfortunately, what the history of science shows, this actually goes back to Thomas Kuhn, a very famous historian of science at the University of Chicago. And he said that, if you look at the sociology and the history of science, he actually said scientists are typically intolerant of new ideas. And so what I'm saying right now is actually pretty well accepted in sort of the field of sociology of science and the history of science. And we have really seen this and experienced it. So, what we have said in the ID movement is that we were getting canceled before cancellation was even cool, like before it was even a thing. They kind of honed their cancellation methods on us. And I don't know if any of you, if you have seen or heard of a documentary called Expelled with Ben Stein. It came out in 2008, but it actually tells the stories of a number of scientists who faced discrimination and persecution because of their views on Darwinian evolution and their support for intelligent design. And this is very real. I mean, I've seen very good people get all kinds of terrible things happening to them because of their not towing the consensus, quote unquote, consensus view on Darwinian evolution, on evolution. So, so what happens with the schools is that as soon as you want to, I mean, let's just not even talk about intelligent design. This happens when we just want to bring in, say, peer-reviewed criticisms of the standard evolutionary paradigm that contradict what students are also going to learn. They should also learn the evidence for evolution, but they contradict, sort of the pro-evolution arguments. What happens is all the local university professors, not all, but, we often have some that come out supporting what we want to do, but, you get the local community college biologists and the local university biology department heads coming out and saying, oh, well, this is not science. There's no disagreement on evolution. There is no conflict. I think that was a line from Darth Vader in Empire Strikes Back. There is no conflict over evolution, and science is settled, and we can't have any discussion over this in this among students. I remember once a leading activist who we call them part of the Darwin lobby. She said that there are no weaknesses in the theory of evolution. So, I mean, you get these really bold dogmatic statements, and this sounds like I'm sort of being a little bit harsh on them. I'm actually giving you like direct quotes from the kind of rhetoric that we regularly experience when we've seen these debates occur on school boards. And what we do is we say, well, look, they can say whatever they want. They have every right to be pro-evolution, but we're going to present you with, 100 peer-reviewed papers that challenge core tenets of the modern theory of evolution and show you that there is a real debate here. And so we're not saying that evolution should be taken out of the schools. We're not even saying that students shouldn't learn the view of the community college professor, that the evolution is correct. His view should be taught. We don't disagree with that. But what we're saying is that you should also teach that there are scientific criticisms of these views. Let students have access to all the evidence. Don't censor. It's really censorship. Don't censor for them. So this problem, Sam, has become very ubiquitous in science over the last few years, this being closed off to new ideas and the politicization of science. It's not just on the evolution topic, although I think that it kind of got, in some ways, got really started or kind of really metastasized within this issue that we work in. But now it's grown well beyond. The cancer has grown well beyond. And there are many people who now have seen over the last few years the politicization of science, the lack of openness to dissenting views, the trying to shut down and marginalize views that disagree with whatever is declared to be the quote unquote consensus of the day. All these things, and look, I'm a scientist, all right? I got a PhD in geology. I've spent a lot of hours in the lab, seen a lot of suns come up in the lab. And I think science is a great thing. I think science is a great tool for learning about the world. So it pains me to see this happening because I think science is really being damaged by this politicization, and it's not good. It's not a healthy state for science to be in. And I hope that scientists of goodwill, whatever their views happen to be, that scientists of goodwill will stand against this and stand for freedom of inquiry, freedom of research, freedom of thought, all these things. It's vital right now that this happens in the scientific community.
Yeah, that's it's wild how you describe that, and it just reminds me of, I feel like, so many things going on in the world today where I wish we could just all get more information and let people have all the information that's out there, then let them make up their mind for themselves.
I mean, big tech is involved right now, right? You Google something and you get a disclaimer warning saying, this is not the consensus view. Well, okay, fine. That's actually okay to know. Like, we should take the consensus very seriously, but the consensus can be right, but the consensus can also be wrong. In fact, every single scientific revolution that ever took place happened because someone was allowed to challenge the consensus. So if you're not allowed to ask hard questions and sort of promote minority scientific views, science can never progress. This is very, very dangerous to the health of science. Yeah,
so true. With Darwin's evolution, I kept reading about a fossil, I think it was called Lucy. What's the intelligent design perspective or thought on their findings of Lucy, the fossil?
So let me be clear about one thing. So within the intelligent design community, there are some people who accept that humans have common ancestry with apes, and there are some people who are skeptical of that.
Okay.
We all, I think, would agree that if you're just to produce, I don't know about all, but I think many folks on both sides of that question of common ancestry would agree that to produce the differences between us and sort of an ape-like ancestor that lived 4 to 8 million years ago would require so many changes to produce a human that it could not have occurred through standard, blind, unguided evolutionary mechanisms, that there's not enough time in the fossil record to produce, the many millions of DNA differences between us and a chimpanzee in just, say 4 to 6 million years since we supposedly shared a common ancestor. I think right now, the best estimates I would say show that there's upwards of 100 million base pair differences between us and a chimpanzee, okay? And so if just, according to some of the papers that have come out studying the mathematics of evolution, a field we call population genetics, if just 2 of those, many, many millions of mutations, if just 2 of them were required in order to give us some advantage, you wouldn't get any advantage until those 2 mutations were present. Then the mathematics of evolution or population genetics suggest that it would take over 200 million years for a trait like that to arise in a population of organisms like hominids, like primates, sort of our supposed ancestors, okay? But yet there's only been about 4 to 6, maybe 8 million years since we shared a common ancestor with chimps, according to the standard view. You can see there's a time problem there. There's not enough time in the fossil record to allow for all the complex differences between us and a chimpanzee to be able to arise in just this short a few million years in the fossil record, okay? So what I would say is whatever is the case, whether we share a common ancestor with apes or not, the origin of humanity was not an unguided, sort of blind evolutionary process. There had to be some intelligence that was guiding it. Now, I personally am a skeptic of human-ape common ancestry. And when I look at the Australopithecines, I see an ape-like species that had many differences from humans. Lucy probably spent most of her time in the trees. She probably was capable of knuckle walking. She probably had some capability to do upright walking, what we call bipedalism. But the upright walking that she had was very well suited for probably walking on tree limbs, okay? It was not a form of bipedalism where she could run and walk like we do. Additionally, Lucy's brain size is basically about the same size as a chimpanzee, okay? So she had a very small brain. Her mode of walking, her mode of locomotion was very different from that of modern humans. And when you look at the technical literature, you can find actually that the mainstream paleoanthropology literature acknowledges that there is a large unbridged gap between the earliest members of our genus Homo, which are very human-like, by the way, and these Australopithecine apes. And there is not fossils that sort of bridge an evolutionary transition between the Australopithecine apes and the earliest members of the genus Homo. There's a large unbridged gap there. That's the kind of language that we see from leading scientists talking about this. So I really don't think that we see good fossil evidence of human-ape common ancestry. You want to talk about the genetics? We sometimes hear that humans and apes have genomes that are 99% the same, only 1% different. That statistic is false. It's been debunked by modern studies of genetics. At the very least, our genomes are somewhere between 4 and probably 16% different from our supposed most closest relative, the chimpanzee, all right? But the point is this, even if we were 99% the same as a chimp, so what, all right? Well, all that shows is that we were built upon a common blueprint, all right? And I think that common design, and we're not 99% the same as a chimp, by the way, it's at best, it's like 96%. And some of the studies suggest perhaps as low as 84% similar. It's actually an open question because we don't have good versions of the chimp genome. And the versions we do have use the human genome as a scaffolding. So they are more human-like than they ought to be. But that's a whole nother question, a whole other topic. But whatever the percent similarity happens to be between humans and chimps, those functional genetic similarities could easily represent us being built upon a common blueprint. Kind of like, getting back to computer programming. When computer programmers write a new program, they will often borrow code from pre-existing programs to write that program. Okay, I used to do that all the time. I would borrow code from me, or I would Google stuff, and figure out how to make the code work. I would, computer programmers do this all the time. Microsoft Windows is just, borrowing the previous version of Windows and then hopefully improving it. Usually it gets better with each iteration, not always, but I'm a Windows user, so I can say that. But that is what computer programmers do. They borrow code. So why couldn't an intelligent agent use a very similar principle of reusing programming modules in our DNA to build new types of organisms. And so we see sort of this common design, this reusage of programming modules in different types of organisms. So the fact that organisms have similar DNA, that could be pointing to common design just as much as it is pointing to common descent. And then, of course, there's our minds, all right? The human mind is totally different from the mind of an ape. I mean, yes, apes are very intelligent. In some cases, they actually can do things that they have very good memories, for example. They can sometimes beat a 4-year-old on a memory test, okay? So fine, apes are smart, all right? But at the end of the day, I mean, they don't have complex language. They are not building complex technology. They don't compose sonnets. They don't compose, they don't interact with religion. They don't create literature. We're the ones that write scientific papers about apes, not the other way around. So there's a huge, massive gulf in the intellectual and cognitive capabilities between a human and our supposed nearest relative, the chimpanzee. What's interesting also, you get this field called evolutionary psychology, which tries to explain the origin of the human mind in evolutionary terms. And according to that field, every human behavior should be tied back to helping our ancestors to survive and reproduce. So everything that you do, Sam, the type of, the way you like to have your bacon cooked, the reason that you love your spouse, the reason that you like the Blue Jays over the Dodgers. I have no idea if you're a baseball fan, whatever it is that you like to do, you do it because of evolutionary reasons that are tied to, forces that caused your ancestors to pass on their genes. Okay. And this is called evolutionary psychology. The problem is that there are many human behaviors that seem to far outstrip the requirements of evolutionary psychology, that our ancestors, all they had to do was just pass on their genes, right? On, say, on the African plains 1 million years ago. If that's all we had to do, why does every single human civilization compose this amazing thing called music? Why do we create beautiful art universally? Why do we all compose literature? Why are we all doing mathematics? Why is every human civilization engaging in, this religious devotion to deities? Why do we build cathedrals? Why are we creating science to study the deep mysteries of the universe? Almost all of humanity's most cherished behaviors would be totally unnecessary if all you had to do was survive and reproduce on the grassland plains of Africa 1 million years ago. All right. There is no reason why you predict all of these complex behaviors that humanity does today. So I think that's very interesting. I think it shows that humanity was designed for purposes that are higher. We were designed for purposes that are higher than mere survival and reproduction. Okay. And it points to the design of our species for higher purposes than just passing on your genes, which is what evolutionary psychology says. At the end of the day, that is the ultimate explanation for everything you do, is just to pass on your genes. Why do we love? Why does Oskar Schindler risk his life to save all these Jews, during World War II, who weren't even part of his clan or his family? It's very difficult for evolutionary psychology to explain many of the most beautiful, cherished human behaviors. Why did a guy die on a cross 2,000 years ago, saying that we should love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us? These are universally held values among all human cultures as the highest form of human morality. But it goes totally against what you would expect if all our ancestors had to do was just pass on their genes on the African plains 1 million years ago. Okay. So I think that evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology in general fails to explain the origin of the human body, human genetics, and the human mind. And I think that intelligent design is a much better explanation.
Yeah. I mean, because it's so complex, like you can't figure it out. Just, I feel like, from natural selection or some, evolution throughout the years. What about if somebody's interested in learning more? They've listened to this podcast, so they're just in general curious. Where could they find more information?
Sure. So please feel free to check out our websites. We've got, I think one of our best ones is just intelligentdesign.org. Sort of a gateway portal to learn a lot about our stuff. You can also go to our main news site, which is evolutionnews.org. We've got daily articles there, evolutionnews.org. And then we have a podcast that's idthefuture.com. So not trying to compete with you, but if you really, if you want to dig even deeper into this kind of stuff, check out ID the Future. You're not going to get the diversity, I'm sure, that people get on your podcast, Sam. But if they want to dive deep on ID, check out idthefuture.com.
No, totally. I actually I have it pulled up right in front of me. With Casey, where do you see this going in the next 100 years? Do you know? Do you see it eventually being more of an accepted theory?
Yeah, so it's really interesting, Sam. What we have seen over the last 10 or 20 years are increasing numbers of papers in the mainstream technical literature that are criticizing the standard evolutionary paradigm. Okay. So it's becoming more and more kosher in evolutionary biology to criticize the standard neo-Darwinian model.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, folks are not ready to give up on purely material, just basically, your purely natural, unguided evolutionary models. So they're coming up with now what they call post-Darwinian models. There are other models of evolution like what we call the extended synthesis. It's a sort of a new Wild West version of evolution where there's supposed to be all these other forces that can possibly help explain how new features arise. When we look at these new models of evolution, we see that actually, in many cases, they're actually even worse than the old Darwinian paradigm, the old neo-Darwinian paradigm at explaining the origin of new complex structures. So I think it's going to take some time, maybe a couple, I don't know, a generation or two, I don't know, but it's going to take some time for evolutionary biologists to realize that, yeah, neo-Darwinism doesn't work, but also many of these post-Darwinian models of evolution don't really get the job done either. They're not totally wrong. I mean, each one is giving us a little piece of the puzzle,
Sure.
but they're not answering these fundamental questions like where do new complex features come from? I think for that, I mean, I think already we see the intelligent design movement and community growing. We see our research program growing. So I think that we're going to continue to grow. We have a summer program where we have students come from all over the world every summer to learn about intelligent design from our top scientists. And many of them are going on now to get graduate degrees, getting faculty positions. And there's sort of now there's this community of new up and coming generation of scientists who are very friendly to intelligent design. They haven't just been hearing the caricatures that were being taught by their college professors. They've learned about ID straight from the scientists who are developing this idea. And they really are, the ones who are going to carry the torch for ID in the future. So I'm very bullish on the long-term future of ID, but I think it's going to take some time for sort of mainstream biology to give up on purely materialistic, naturalistic models. And once they get to that point, I think they're going to be willing to consider intelligent design, but it could take some time to get there.
Well, Casey, thank you so much for joining me, man. This has been incredible. You've educated me to a new level, I think, in my own thinking and understanding of it. So thank you for joining me. Thank you for taking time out of your first day back from vacation. I really appreciate it, but for real, thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much, Sam. Appreciate your time and appreciate the great questions.